Echoes of a Broken World, Chapter 1. The Silence After the Storm. The world had ended not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whimper. That's what Ethan always told himself when the silence around him grew too deafening. It had been 6 years since the collapse. 6 years since the old world had been torn apart by fire, famine, and fury. 6 years since the sun had last shone bright in the sky, untainted by the ashen clouds that now cloaked the earth in perpetual twilight. He pulled his coat tighter around his body, feeling the cold bite of the wind as it whistled through the crumbling remains of what used to be a bustling city. The once proud skyscrapers now leaned at unnatural angles, their glass facades shattered, their steel frames twisted like broken bones. The streets, once filled with people, cars, and the hum of life, were empty, save for the occasional scavenger or wild animal. Nature was slowly reclaiming what humanity had taken, vines creeping up the walls of buildings, trees growing through cracks in the pavement. Ethan didn't mind the quiet, though. It was better than the alternative. The sound of footsteps in this world was almost always followed by violence. Bandits, gangs, and the desperate remnants of humanity prowled the ruins like wolves, hungry and savage. But Ethan had learned how to avoid them, how to move through the shadows, how to survive. Surviving was all that mattered now. He wasn't sure how much longer he could do it, though. Supplies were running low. The canned food he had scavenged months ago was nearly gone, and clean water was becoming harder to find. He had heard rumors of a settlement up north, a place where the last remnants of civilization had gathered. It sounded like a fairy tale, too good to be true. But Ethan had nothing left to lose. As he moved through the decaying city, his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, looking for any signs of danger. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife, his only weapon. Guns had long since become useless. The bullets were all but gone, and those who still had them weren't the kind of people Ethan wanted to deal with. He came across the remains of a grocery store, its windows long shattered, its shelves stripped bare. But Ethan knew better than to pass up any potential source of food. Sometimes, the old world left behind hidden treasures, and sometimes those treasures could mean the difference between life and death. Inside, the store was eerily quiet. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the occasional gust of wind that slipped through the broken windows. Most of the shelves were empty, save for a few rusted cans and broken bottles. Ethan moved carefully, not wanting to make any noise. There were others out there, always watching, always waiting for someone to let their guard down. At the back of the store, he found a small storeroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, he felt a flicker of hope. Inside, there were still a few intact boxes, their labels faded and worn. He rifled through them, finding a few cans of beans, some powdered milk, and a packet of dried meat. It wasn't much, but it would keep him going for a little while longer. As he packed the supplies into his bag, Ethan froze. He had heard something, a sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from the front of the store. His heart raced as he silently moved to the side of the storeroom, pressing his back against the wall. He could hear them now, getting closer. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet, but they weren't as good at it as Ethan. He drew his knife, holding it tightly in his hand, his breath shallow. The footsteps stopped just outside the storeroom. Ethan held his breath, waiting. The door creaked open, and for a split second, he saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the broken windows. Before the intruder could react, Ethan lunged, his knife aimed at their throat. But the figure moved faster than he expected, sidestepping his attack and grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. They twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the knife, and in an instant, Ethan found himself pinned against the wall, the blade now at his own throat. "Wait!" the figure hissed, their voice low and urgent. "I'm not here to hurt you. V?" Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. His first instinct was to fight back, to try and wrestle the knife from the stranger's grip. But something in their voice gave him pause. There was no malice, no threat, just desperation. "Who are you?" he growled, his eyes locked on the stranger's face. They were wearing a hood, their features obscured, but he could make out the sharp lines of their jaw, the slight curve of their lips. The stranger hesitated for a moment before speaking. "My name is Sam. I'm just trying to survive, same as you. Ethan narrowed his eyes, still not trusting the stranger, but he could sense the truth in their words. Slowly, Sam released him, stepping back and lowering the knife. I didn't mean to startle you, Sam said, their voice softer now. I was just looking for supplies. Ethan rubbed his wrist, still aching from the grip. There's not much left, he muttered, eyeing Sam warily. I figured as much, Sam replied, glancing around the room, but you never know. Ethan was silent for a moment, considering his options. He could try to drive Sam away, keep the supplies for himself, but something told him that might not be the best idea. The world was a dangerous place, and sometimes having an ally, even a temporary one, was better than being alone. You're not with one of the gangs, are you? Ethan asked, his voice hard. Sam shook their head. No, I stay away from them. Good, Ethan said, relaxing slightly, because I'm not looking for trouble. Neither am I, Sam replied, offering a small smile. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to survive this broken world alone. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. Ethan and Sam had settled into an uneasy truce. The world they inhabited did not foster trust easily, but the alternative, complete solitude, was often far more dangerous. They had agreed to travel together, at least for now, as they navigated through the decaying city. The road ahead was uncertain, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more they risked an encounter with the gangs that patrolled the outskirts. The sky above remained a dull, lifeless gray, and the air carried a cold, metallic tang that reminded Ethan of the ruined factories and abandoned steel plants that now littered the landscape. He'd grown used to it, but the oppressive weight of the atmosphere never truly left him. Even now, with Sam walking beside him, the emptiness of the world pressed down on them both. The two walked in silence for most of the morning, weaving through broken streets and shattered alleyways. Sam's presence was steady but quiet, as if they were measuring each of Ethan's movements, waiting for the right moment to speak. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Sam broke the silence. You said you're not with the gangs, Sam began, their voice cautious. Then who are you with? What keeps you going? Ethan glanced sideways at Sam but kept walking. No one. I'm on my own. Before all of this, I had a family. They didn't make it. Sam didn't respond immediately. They just nodded as if they'd heard this story many times before from others. Everyone had lost someone. It was the one thing that bound the survivors together, the shared pain of loss, even if they never spoke about it. What about you? Ethan asked, his tone flat. You've got your own story, don't you? Sam's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ethan thought they wouldn't answer. But then Sam sighed, their shoulders slumping just a little. I used to be part of a group, Sam said quietly. A settlement. We had walls, supplies, protection. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than wandering out here alone. We called it sanctuary. Ethan felt a slight pang of something. Jealousy, maybe. Sanctuary. The word felt foreign on his tongue, like something that belonged to a different world, a different time. What happened? He asked, though he could guess the answer. Sam's face darkened, their eyes distant as they remembered. It was attacked. Raiders. They tore through us, killed most of the people. A few of us escaped, but there wasn't anything left to go back to. I've been on the road ever since. The conversation died after that, the weight of Sam's words hanging in the air between them. Ethan understood that kind of pain, the kind that didn't fade, no matter how far you ran from it. He didn't press any further. The ruins around them began to change as they moved deeper into the city. The skeletal remains of buildings gave way to more intact structures, though they were still scarred by the destruction. These areas were more dangerous, as they often housed other survivors, many of whom were desperate or hostile. We need to find somewhere to rest soon, Sam said, scanning the area ahead. We've been walking for hours. There's no point in pushing ourselves too far. Ethan nodded in agreement. He'd learned the hard way that exhaustion was a death sentence in this world. They moved cautiously through the streets, eyes peeled for any sign of movement. Eventually, they came across an old apartment building that seemed mostly intact. The windows were boarded up and the front door hung off its hinges, but it looked abandoned, at least for now. Let's check it out, Ethan suggested, leading the way. Inside, the apartment was musty and cold. Dust covered every surface, and the air was stale, but it was better than being outside. The first floor was quiet, with no signs of recent activity. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, where they found a small apartment that hadn't been ransacked as thoroughly as others. A couch, though torn and weathered, sat in the middle of the room, and there were still a few cabinets left in the kitchen. "We'll stay here for the night," Ethan said. "I'll take first watch." Sam didn't argue. They dropped their pack on the floor and slumped down onto the couch, clearly exhausted. Ethan moved to the window, peering out through the cracks in the boards. The street below was empty, but that didn't mean it would stay that way. As the minutes stretched into hours, Ethan's mind began to wander. It wasn't often that he allowed himself to think about the past, but Sam's mention of sanctuary had stirred something in him. Memories he had long buried began to resurface. Memories of his family, of the life he'd once had before everything fell apart. He remembered the day the world had changed. The collapse had come in waves, first the earthquakes, then the fires, and finally the sickness. Cities crumbled, governments failed, and society descended into chaos. Those who survived were left to fend for themselves, scavenging for food and fighting over what little was left. Ethan had been a different man back then, softer perhaps, more hopeful. But that man had died along with the world. Now there was only survival, day by day, hour by hour. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. Ethan and Sam had settled into an uneasy truce. The world they inhabited did not foster trust easily, but the alternative, complete solitude, was often far more dangerous. They had agreed to travel together, at least for now, as they navigated through the decaying city. The road ahead was uncertain, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more they risked an encounter with the gangs that patrolled the outskirts. The sky above remained a dull, lifeless gray, and the air carried a cold, metallic tang that reminded Ethan of the ruined factories and abandoned steel plants that now littered the landscape. He'd grown used to it, but the oppressive weight of the atmosphere never truly left him. Even now, with Sam walking beside him, the emptiness of the world pressed down on them both. The two walked in silence for most of the morning, weaving through broken streets and shattered alleyways. Sam's presence was steady but quiet, as if they were measuring each of Ethan's movements, waiting for the right moment to speak. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Sam broke the silence. "You said you're not with the gangs," Sam began, their voice cautious. "Then who are you with? What keeps you going?" Ethan glanced sideways at Sam but kept walking. "No one. I'm on my own. Before all of this, I had a family. They didn't make it." Sam didn't respond immediately. They just nodded, as if they'd heard this story many times before, from others. Everyone had lost someone. It was the one thing that bound the survivors together, the shared pain of loss, even if they never spoke about it. "What about you?" Ethan asked, his tone flat. "You've got your own story, don't you?" Sam's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ethan thought they wouldn't answer. But then Sam sighed, their shoulders slumping just a little. "I used to be part of a group," Sam said quietly. "A settlement. We had walls, supplies, protection. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than wandering out here alone. We called it sanctuary." Ethan felt a slight pang of something. Jealousy, maybe. Sanctuary. The word felt foreign on his tongue, like something that belonged to a different world, a different time. "What happened?" he asked, though he could guess the answer. Sam's face darkened, their eyes distant as they remembered. "It was attacked. Raiders. They tore through us, killed most of the people. A few of us escaped, but there wasn't anything left to go back to. I've been on the road ever since." The conversation died after that, the weight of Sam's words hanging in the air between them. Ethan understood that kind of pain, the kind that didn't fade, no matter how far you ran from it. He didn't press any further. Chapter 3. The Bargain of Trust. The morning light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows was weak and colorless. It did little to lift the oppressive gloom that hung in the apartment. Ethan had barely slept, his mind constantly turning over the events of the previous night. Marcus's arrival had thrown everything off balance. Trust was already a rare and fragile thing between Ethan and Sam, but adding another person into the mix was even more precarious. Marcus sat across from them at the small, broken-down table, nervously fidgeting with the rusted pipe he had been carrying the night before. His eyes darted between Ethan and Sam, sizing them up, probably wondering if they were going to turn on him at any moment. The tension was palpable, like a taut string that could snap with the slightest wrong move. Ethan crossed his arms, his voice cold and guarded. "So, Marcus, you said you're not with the scavengers. What were you doing wandering around here alone?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at the floor before answering. "I was part of a group once, small, maybe 5 of us. We'd been on the move for months trying to find somewhere safe. But one by one, things went bad. First, it was raiders. Then, disease. Then, just bad luck." Ethan watched Marcus's eyes as he spoke, searching for any hint of deceit. He didn't detect any obvious lies, but trust had to be earned, not given freely. "How did you end up here, in this part of the city?" Sam asked, their voice calm but laced with suspicion. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand through his dirty hair. "I had heard rumors of a supply cache somewhere in this area. People talk about it like it's the last gold mine. Untouched food, clean water, maybe even medicine. I figured I'd give it a shot. It was that or starve." Sam's eyes narrowed. "A supply cache? That sounds like a fairy tale." Marcus shrugged. "Maybe, but what else do we have out here besides rumors and hope?" Ethan exchanged a glance with Sam. The mention of supplies piqued his interest, but the idea of wandering blindly after whispers was dangerous. Yet, if there was even the slightest chance it was true, it could be the difference between life and death. "And what's your plan now?" Ethan asked, leaning forward slightly. "You've got nothing left. No group, no direction. You show up here, and what? You want to tag along with us?" Marcus held up his hands defensively. "I'm not asking for a handout. I know how it looks, but I'm not useless. I can pull my weight. I'm not looking to leech off anyone. You help me find those supplies, and we split whatever we find. I'm just trying to survive, same as you." Ethan was silent for a moment, considering Marcus's offer. He had heard similar deals before, and most of them ended in betrayal or disappointment. But right now, they were all running low on supplies, and the city wasn't getting any safer. If Marcus was telling the truth, the cache could sustain them for weeks, maybe longer. If he was lying, well, Ethan had dealt with worse. Sam shifted in their seat, speaking up before Ethan could. "And how do we know you won't stab us in the back the moment we're out there? People like you, people like us, are desperate, and desperate people do desperate things." Marcus met Sam's gaze, his expression hard. "You don't know, and I don't expect you to trust me right away, but you've got nothing to lose, and neither do I." Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window, peeking through the cracks. The streets outside were quiet for now, but that could change in an instant. He hated this feeling, being cornered, having to make choices without enough information. The world had taken away the luxury of certainty. "We'll go," Ethan said finally, his voice firm. "But you stay in front. We don't trust you, and I'm not risking our lives on the word of a stranger. If you're lying or if you try anything, anything at all, you won't live long enough to regret it. Understood?" Marcus nodded, swallowing nervously. "Understood." Sam didn't look entirely convinced, but they kept their thoughts to themselves. Instead, they stood up, gathering their few belongings and slinging their bag over their shoulder. Ethan did the same, double-checking his knife and the small amount of food they had left. It wasn't much, but it would last a day or two if they were careful. The 3 of them left the apartment cautiously, making their way down the crumbling staircase and out into the ruined streets. The air was cold and still, and the distant sound of wind echoed through the hollowed-out shells of buildings. It felt like a graveyard, silent, dead, and full of ghosts. Marcus led the way, his steps quiet but sure, as if he knew where he was going. Ethan kept a close eye on him, his hand never far from the hilt of his knife. Sam walked a few paces behind, equally wary. Trust, if it ever came, would come slowly. "So, where exactly is this supposed cache?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence as they moved through the maze of debris and broken structures. Marcus pointed to the east, toward a section of the city they hadn't yet explored. "There's an old government building about 10 blocks from here. Back before the collapse, it was rumored to be some kind of emergency shelter. If it's still intact, there might be supplies left inside." "Emergency shelter?" Sam repeated, skeptical. You think anything useful could have survived this long? That place has probably been picked clean a dozen times over. Marcus shrugged but didn't slow his pace. Maybe. But it's the best lead I've got, and no one's been brave enough to go inside for years, not since the scavengers took control of the area. Ethan felt a pang of dread. The scavengers. They were one of the largest and most brutal gangs that roamed the outskirts of the city, preying on anyone who crossed their path. They didn't just steal food or supplies, they hunted people. The stories Ethan had heard were enough to make even the toughest survivors avoid them at all costs. You're telling us we're heading into scavenger territory? Ethan asked, his voice low and tense. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, but we don't have much choice. It's either risk going in or starve out here. Sam cursed under their breath, shaking their head. This is suicide. Ethan's grip tightened on his knife, the weight of the situation sinking in. They were walking straight into danger, into the heart of a nightmare. But Marcus was right. They didn't have much choice. With supplies running low and no other options, the risk was unavoidable. The buildings around them began to change, growing more intact and less ravaged by time. These were the kinds of places the scavengers liked to patrol, using the sturdier structures as bases of operation. Ethan's senses were on high alert now, every sound making his heart race. They passed through an alleyway, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Ethan could feel Sam's unease growing, the same fear gnawing at his own insides. And then, just as they rounded a corner, Marcus stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. There it is, he whispered. Ahead of them stood a massive, dilapidated building, its walls cracked and covered in vines, but still standing. The faded symbol of an old government agency was barely visible on the front, worn down by years of neglect. The windows were dark, the entrance blocked by debris, but the building had a sense of foreboding that made Ethan's skin crawl. We'll need to find a way in, Marcus said quietly. But be careful. If the scavengers are nearby, we can't afford to make any noise. Ethan's pulse quickened as he scanned the area. There was no sign of movement, but that didn't mean they were alone. The scavengers were experts at staying hidden until it was too late. Let's move, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. And stay sharp. As they approached the building, Ethan felt a knot of tension tighten in his chest. The world outside might have been deadly, but whatever awaited them inside this crumbling fortress of the old world could be far worse. Chapter 4. Into the Lion's Den. The weight of the silence felt heavier as Ethan, Sam, and Marcus approached the government building. The air seemed thicker, the sky darker, and the threat of unseen dangers more immediate. The building loomed in front of them like a giant tomb, a relic of a dead world, holding secrets that could either save them or doom them. Ethan crouched behind a crumbling car frame, scanning the street for any sign of movement. The entrance to the building was partially blocked by debris, but it wasn't impassable. His eyes lingered on the windows, dark, broken, and menacing, wondering if anyone was watching them from within. We should check the perimeter first, Sam whispered, their voice low and urgent. See if there's a back way in. The main entrance might be a trap. Ethan nodded. Agreed. Let's stay low and keep quiet. We can't afford to get spotted. Marcus, already looking more nervous than before, glanced around, clearly on edge. The scavengers have been known to set traps around places like this. We need to watch our step. Let's move, Ethan ordered, his voice firm. The three of them kept to the shadows as they circled the building, moving as silently as possible over the cracked pavement. The faint smell of decay hung in the air, mixing with the musty scent of the old city. Ethan's senses were sharp, every noise amplified in the oppressive silence. His grip tightened around his knife, ready for anything. They reached the back of the building, where a service entrance door hung off its rusted hinges. It was barely recognizable, hidden behind a tangle of vines and debris. It looked like no one had used it in years. This could work, Marcus whispered, crouching beside the door. But it'll be noisy to move all this rubble. We don't have a choice, Ethan muttered, glancing over his shoulder. He didn't like standing in the open like this. They were too exposed. Together, the three of them began clearing away the debris, careful not to make too much noise. Every scrape of metal against stone sounded deafening in the eerie stillness. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they worked, each second dragging on with the weight of unseen eyes watching. Finally, the door was clear enough for them to squeeze through. Marcus went in first, followed by Sam, with Ethan bringing up the rear, keeping his eyes on their surroundings until the last moment. Inside, the building was cold and damp, the air stale and heavy with dust. The walls were cracked, paint peeling off in long strips. The faint echo of their footsteps bounced off the walls, making Ethan feel like they were walking into the belly of the beast. They stood still for a moment, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness. Ethan scanned the area. The hallway stretched out in front of them, dimly lit by the faintest slivers of light that filtered in through broken windows. The floor was littered with debris, discarded papers, broken furniture, and the remnants of a world that no longer existed. "This place feels wrong," Sam whispered, their voice barely audible. Ethan couldn't disagree. The atmosphere was oppressive, as though the building itself was suffocating them. But they didn't have the luxury of fear. They needed those supplies, and this was the best chance they had. "We stay together," Ethan said quietly. "No splitting up. We find the supplies, grab what we can, and get out. Fast." Marcus nodded in agreement, though he looked pale. He gestured toward a nearby staircase that led down into the basement. "If there's anything valuable left, it's likely down there. The emergency shelter was supposed to be in the lower levels." Ethan didn't like the idea of going deeper into the building, but they didn't have much choice. The three of them moved cautiously toward the staircase, their footsteps eerily silent. As they descended, the darkness grew thicker and the air colder. The faint sounds of dripping water echoed from somewhere below, mixing with the creaks and groans of the decaying structure. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a narrow hallway, the walls lined with old, rusted lockers. Faded posters from a bygone era still clung to the walls, their messages now meaningless in the broken world. The flickering of their flashlight cast long, dancing shadows along the walls, making the place feel even more claustrophobic. Chapter 4. Into the Lion's Den. The weight of the silence felt heavier as Ethan, Sam, and Marcus approached the government building. The air seemed thicker, the sky darker, and the threat of unseen dangers more immediate. The building loomed in front of them like a giant tomb, a relic of a dead world, holding secrets that could either save them or doom them. Ethan crouched behind a crumbling car frame, scanning the street for any sign of movement. The entrance to the building was partially blocked by debris, but it wasn't impassable. His eyes lingered on the windows, dark, broken, and menacing, wondering if anyone was watching them from within. "We should check the perimeter first," Sam whispered, their voice low and urgent. "See if there's a back way in. The main entrance might be a trap." Ethan nodded. "Agreed. Let's stay low and keep quiet. We can't afford to get spotted." Marcus, already looking more nervous than before, glanced around, clearly on edge. "The scavengers have been known to set traps around places like this. We need to watch our step." "Let's move," Ethan ordered, his voice firm. The three of them kept to the shadows as they circled the building, moving as silently as possible over the cracked pavement. The faint smell of decay hung in the air, mixing with the musty scent of the old city. Ethan's senses were sharp, every noise amplified in the oppressive silence. His grip tightened around his knife, ready for anything. They reached the back of the building, where a service entrance door hung off its rusted hinges. It was barely recognizable, hidden behind a tangle of vines and debris. It looked like no one had used it in years. "This could work," Marcus whispered, crouching beside the door. "But it'll be noisy to move all this rubble." "We don't have a choice," Ethan muttered, glancing over his shoulder. He didn't like standing in the open like this. They were too exposed. Ethan's grip tightened on his knife as he peeked around the doorframe, his breath shallow. His worst fear had come true. The scavengers were here. Two figures appeared in the hallway, both armed with makeshift weapons, their faces hidden under dirty masks. They moved with the practiced ease of predators, scanning the area as if they owned it. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't fight these men head-on. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Their only chance was to stay hidden and hope the scavengers didn't find them. The two men entered the room across from where Ethan, Sam, and Marcus were hiding, their voices low but audible. Nothing here, one of them muttered. Place is picked clean. The other man grunted. Keep looking. There's supposed to be a stash down here somewhere. We find it, we're set for months. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the men moved farther into the room. He signaled to Sam and Marcus with a quick hand gesture. We need to move, now. They crept silently toward the hallway, staying low and avoiding the flashlight beams that swept across the floor. Every step felt like an eternity, each one threatening to give them away. Ethan led the way, his eyes darting between the scavengers and the exit. The tension was suffocating. Just as they reached the stairs, one of the scavengers called out, "Hey, over here!" Ethan's blood turned to ice. Had they been spotted? No. The scavenger was pointing to another room down the hall, not at them. Looks like a stash of food. Jackpot, the man said. The distraction was all they needed. Without a word, Ethan signaled for them to make their move. They bolted up the stairs, moving as fast and silently as they could. The moment they reached the main floor, they broke into a full sprint, bursting out of the building and into the cold, empty streets. They didn't stop running until they were well away from the building, the safety of distance finally allowing them to catch their breath. Ethan leaned against a wall, his heart still racing. That was too close, Sam panted, wiping sweat from their brow. Marcus was gasping for air, his face pale with fear. We did it. We got the supplies. Ethan nodded, though the knot of tension in his stomach hadn't gone away. They had survived, but just barely. The scavengers weren't far behind, and if they realized the cache had been raided, they'd come looking for whoever had taken it. We need to keep moving, Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. They'll be after us soon. With bags full of supplies and danger hot on their heels, the three of them disappeared into the labyrinth of the ruined city, their survival hanging by a thread. Chapter 5. The thin line between survival and betrayal. The air was still cold and heavy as Ethan, Sam, and Marcus pushed through the labyrinth of the city's shattered streets, their bodies sore and their breath labored. The weight of their newfound supplies wasn't lost on them. It was a blessing, but also a burden that made them a target. The scavengers would be on their trail soon, if they weren't already. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the ruins. The world was quieter in this part of the city, far from the scavengers' strongholds, but not far enough to give any sense of real safety. We need to find shelter, Ethan said, his voice hushed but firm. We can't keep moving like this, not with night coming. We'll be sitting ducks out here. Marcus, still pale and shaken from their near-death escape, nodded weakly. There's an old subway station not far from here. I passed by it before, might still be intact. Sam shot Marcus a glance, still suspicious of him. You're sure it hasn't been taken over? We can't afford any more surprises. I'm sure, Marcus replied, his voice cracking slightly with exhaustion. It's too deep underground for most people to bother with. Besides, it's collapsed in places, hard to navigate. Ethan weighed their options. Moving through the city at night was suicide, but staying out in the open wasn't much better. If the station was as deserted as Marcus said, it could buy them a few hours to rest, maybe plan their next move. All right, Ethan said, lead the way. But if it's a trap? Marcus didn't need Ethan to finish the sentence. He nodded grimly and started walking toward the subway station, his steps hesitant but determined. The streets grew narrower as they approached the station. Buildings leaned in precariously, some half collapsed, others standing like crooked gravestones marking the fall of civilization. Ethan's senses were on high alert. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. They arrived at the entrance of the subway station, barely recognizable beneath layers of grime and debris. The once grand stairs leading down to the underground were cracked and uneven, overgrown with weeds and scattered with rubble. Marcus led them cautiously down, and soon, the world above was replaced by the damp, claustrophobic atmosphere of the tunnels below. The stale air was thick with mildew, and the faint echo of their footsteps bounced off the grimy walls. The tunnel was darker than the surface, but not pitch black. Occasional shafts of fading sunlight filtered in through broken grates above, creating eerie beams that illuminated small sections of the passageway. This way, Marcus whispered, pointing to a corridor that split off from the main tunnel. Ethan and Sam followed, their grips tight on their makeshift weapons. The deeper they went, the more silent it became, the hum of the city above giving way to the unsettling stillness of the underground. Finally, they reached a small, collapsed section where the roof had caved in, creating a barrier of debris that was difficult but not impossible to climb over. "Through here," Marcus said, pulling himself over the pile of rubble. On the other side was a small platform, once part of the old subway system, now forgotten. The station was quiet, abandoned. "This'll do," Sam muttered, dropping their pack and scanning the area. "At least it's out of the way." Ethan nodded, though he still didn't feel entirely comfortable. They were hidden, but that didn't mean they were safe. The scavengers had a way of finding people who didn't want to be found. Marcus sank to the ground, exhausted. "We should be good here for the night. No one comes down this far anymore." "Let's hope so," Ethan replied, though his mind was still racing. The supplies were a win, but it had come at a price. The scavengers now knew someone was in their territory, and that someone had stolen from them. They wouldn't rest until they had their revenge. The three of them ate in silence, sharing some of the canned food they had risked their lives for. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a fragile peace hanging between them. Ethan could feel Sam's mistrust of Marcus growing, but for now, they were stuck with each other. As they finished their meal, Sam broke the silence. "We can't stay together forever. You know that, right?" Ethan looked at Sam, understanding the unspoken message behind their words. They were thinking about Marcus, about whether they could truly trust him, about whether keeping him around was more dangerous than letting him go. Marcus, sensing the shift in tone, sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not your enemy. I helped you get those supplies, didn't I? We're in this together." "Are we?" Sam shot back, their voice laced with skepticism. "Or are you just waiting for the right moment to turn on us? You said it yourself. Desperate people do desperate things." Marcus's face tightened. "I'm not desperate. I'm just trying to survive, same as you. You think I wanted this? To be out here alone, scavenging for scraps? I didn't ask for any of this." "None of us did," Ethan said, cutting in before the argument could escalate. "But the fact is, we're stuck in this hellhole, and the only way we get out is if we trust each other, or at least tolerate each other long enough to figure out what comes next." Sam's gaze shifted to Ethan, their expression hard. "So what's your plan then?" "We're running from the scavengers with no long-term goal. What happens when we run out of places to hide?" Ethan didn't have an answer. The world outside was closing in on them, and every option felt like a dead end. The city was a death trap, and the further they ventured, the harder it became to see a way out. "We can't just keep running forever," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe we should." A noise. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of shuffling footsteps coming from the tunnel they had entered through. All three of them froze, their eyes darting toward the entrance. The noise grew louder, closer, until it became clear that someone or something was in the tunnels with them. Ethan motioned for silence, his heart racing as he grabbed his knife. Sam was already moving toward the back of the platform, finding a dark corner to hide in. Marcus looked panicked, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay low," Ethan whispered, edging toward the rubble pile that separated them from the main tunnel. His pulse thundered in his ears as he peered over the debris, straining to see what was coming. Two figures appeared in the dim light of the tunnel, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't scavengers, at least not the kind Ethan had encountered before. These men were different. Their clothes were ragged, their faces gaunt, but they moved with a strange sense of purpose, as if they were searching for something. Ethan ducked back down, his mind racing. They weren't part of the group that had chased them earlier, but that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. The desperation in their eyes suggested they were hunting for something, or someone. "What do we do?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. Ethan weighed his options. They could try to sneak out, back through the tunnel, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't be spotted. And even if they escaped, it would put them right back in scavenger territory. "We wait," Ethan said quietly, gripping his knife tighter. "If they get too close, we fight." The tension was unbearable as the figures moved closer, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Ethan's muscles tensed, ready to strike if necessary. He could feel Sam's eyes on him from across the platform, ready for whatever came next. But then, just as the two men reached the entrance to the platform, they stopped. One of them knelt down, examining something on the ground. Ethan held his breath, praying they wouldn't come any closer. The man stood up, shaking his head. "Nothing here," he muttered. "Just rats." His companion grunted, and the two of them turned, disappearing back into the tunnel. Ethan exhaled, the weight of relief washing over him. But the relief was short-lived. Those men were desperate scavengers, just like them, and they wouldn't be the last. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said quietly, standing up and motioning for Sam and Marcus to follow. "This place isn't safe." Sam looked at him, their face hard and determined. Where to? Ethan didn't know, but staying here would only get them killed. They had to keep moving, keep surviving, one day at a time. With the supplies packed up and the danger still lurking in the shadows, Ethan led them back into the tunnels, their future uncertain, their trust in each other fragile at best. Chapter 6: The Burden of Trust. The air in the subway tunnel felt heavier as Ethan, Sam, and Marcus pressed forward, their footsteps echoing faintly off the crumbling walls. The tension between them was palpable, thick as the dust that clung to the damp floor. The encounter with the two scavengers had shaken them all, a harsh reminder that the world outside was closing in, and fast. Ethan kept his eyes forward, leading them deeper into the labyrinth of the underground system. His thoughts churned with every step. They had narrowly avoided a fight back at the station, but their luck wouldn't hold forever. Sooner or later, they'd be forced into a confrontation. The weight of the supplies on their backs was as much a curse as it was a blessing. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, their only guide the weak beams of their flashlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. The tunnel seemed endless, a winding maze of decay and forgotten history. Every few minutes they'd stop to listen, to make sure no one was following them. But all they heard was the faint drip of water from the ceiling and the distant groan of the earth shifting above. Marcus was the first to break the silence. "We can't keep going like this," he said, his voice thin and strained. "We need a plan, somewhere to go." Ethan shot him a glance but didn't respond right away. He knew Marcus was right. They couldn't just keep wandering aimlessly, hoping to avoid the scavengers. They needed a destination, a goal. But where? The world above was chaos, and the safe zones, if any still existed, were long out of reach. Sam, walking a few steps behind, spoke up, their voice colder than usual. "And what's your brilliant idea, Marcus? You seem to know these tunnels pretty well. Got another hideout in mind?" Marcus flinched at the sarcasm but didn't snap back. He seemed too tired to argue. "I've heard rumors," he began, his eyes flicking toward Ethan for a brief moment. "There's supposed to be a group, a resistance, somewhere in the north, past the old industrial district. People say they've been rebuilding, trying to take back control of the city." Sam let out a short, bitter laugh. "A resistance? Rebuilding the city? Sounds like a fairy tale. You really think there's anyone left with the resources or the will to fight back?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I'd rather take my chances with them than keep running from scavengers." Ethan stayed quiet, weighing the possibilities. A resistance could mean safety, a place to regroup. But it could also mean walking into another war zone, one where they didn't know who to trust, and they barely trusted each other as it was. "I think we should check it out," Marcus continued, his voice gaining a little strength. "We can't survive on our own forever. Sooner or later, we're going to need more than just supplies. We need people. Allies." Sam muttered darkly. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face them both. "It's a risk either way. Staying out here on our own is suicide. But heading north, that's not much better. We don't know what's waiting for us." Sam crossed their arms, their eyes hard as steel. "So what? We're just supposed to trust him? Trust that this resistance even exists?" "No," Ethan said firmly, locking eyes with both of them. "We don't trust anyone, but we weigh our options. And right now, heading north sounds better than wandering until we starve or get picked off by scavengers." Sam's expression didn't soften, but they didn't argue either. Instead, they just turned away, muttering under their breath. "Fine," Sam finally said. "But if this turns out to be a trap or another one of Marcus's mistakes, it's on him." Marcus didn't respond, but the weight of Sam's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Without another word, they pressed on through the tunnel, heading toward the north, the industrial district, where Marcus's rumored resistance might be waiting, or where more danger lurked. Either way, they had a direction now, a purpose, even if it was born out of desperation. The tunnel began to slope upward after several hours, and they could feel the change in the air as they got closer to the surface. The damp, mildew scent of the underground gave way to something different, fresher, but still tinged with the scent of decay. Ethan motioned for them to stop as they reached an old service ladder, rusted and half collapsed, leading up to what looked like an access hatch. "We're close to the surface," Ethan said quietly, scanning the area. "We'll go up one at a time. I'll go first. If it's clear, I'll signal." He didn't wait for a response. Climbing the ladder was slow, the metal creaking under his weight as he ascended, each step sending vibrations through the rickety structure. When he reached the top, he carefully pushed the hatch open a crack, just enough to peer through. The world outside was just as broken as he remembered. They were in a side street, hidden from view by a collapsed building that shielded most of the road. The sky above was darkening, heavy with storm clouds that threatened to unleash more misery on the ruins of the city. Ethan listened for a moment, straining his ears for any sign of movement. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the distant rumble of thunder. It was as safe as it was going to get. He opened the hatch fully and climbed out, crouching low to keep out of sight. After scanning the area again, he motioned for Sam and Marcus to follow. One by one, they emerged from the tunnel, blinking against the faint daylight that filtered through the overcast sky. The city felt different up here, still dangerous, but not as oppressive as the suffocating darkness of the underground. The open space made them feel vulnerable, but it also gave them room to breathe. "Where to now?" Sam asked, still crouched low, their eyes darting to the surrounding buildings. Marcus pointed to the north, where the jagged outlines of the industrial district rose against the horizon. "That way. It'll take us a few days if we move carefully, but we'll need to find shelter before nightfall." Ethan nodded, already scanning for any potential hiding spots. They couldn't keep moving in the open, not when the city was crawling with scavengers and worse. A nearby building, half collapsed but still standing, caught his eye. It looked like an old factory, its windows broken and its walls crumbling, but it might provide enough cover for the night. "There," Ethan said, pointing toward it. "We'll hole up there for now, rest and move again at first light." They moved quickly but cautiously, keeping to the shadows as they made their way to the factory. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made Ethan's skin crawl. Too quiet. He had the distinct feeling they were being watched, though he couldn't pinpoint where the threat was coming from. They reached the factory without incident, slipping inside through a broken window. The interior was dark and musty, filled with rusted machinery and stacks of old, decaying crates. It was a mess, but it was better than sleeping out in the open. Ethan secured the door, using a piece of debris to block it from the inside. Sam checked the windows, making sure they weren't exposed to the outside, while Marcus collapsed onto the floor, his face pale and drawn. "We'll take turns keeping watch," Ethan said, pulling out a ragged blanket from his pack and tossing it to Marcus. "Get some rest." Sam didn't argue, but the tension between them hadn't disappeared. The mistrust was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. Ethan knew it wouldn't take much for it to boil over. As the sun disappeared completely and darkness engulfed the city, they settled into their makeshift camp, the weight of exhaustion finally catching up with them. But sleep wouldn't come easy, not with the dangers that lurked both outside and within their fragile alliance. Ethan took the first watch, his knife resting on his lap as he stared into the dark, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The resistance, if it existed, was their only real hope. But could they survive long enough to find it? Or would the mistrust tearing them apart from the inside destroy them before they ever had a chance to reach safety? As the wind howled through the broken windows and the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the city, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 7. A Desperate Gamble. The wind whistled through the cracks in the crumbling walls of the factory, carrying the scent of rot and decay. Ethan sat near a broken window, watching the darkened streets through the glassless pane. His knife lay on his knee, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The city was alive with dangers, and the feeling of being hunted never left him. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. Behind him, Sam and Marcus were huddled on the cold, hard floor, wrapped in the thin blankets they had scavenged. Sam was lying awake, their eyes closed, but Ethan knew they weren't sleeping. They never let their guard down completely. Marcus, on the other hand, was tossing and turning, muttering incoherently in his sleep. The weight of the day's events had clearly worn on him. As Ethan's eyes darted to the far corner of the factory, something caught his attention. A faint flicker of light. His heart skipped a beat. It was faint, barely visible, but there, a small orange glow in the distance. Someone had a fire going. He froze, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. A fire meant people, and people out here usually meant trouble. The thought of scavengers finding them while they were trapped inside the factory sent a cold shiver down his spine. He slid down from his position, moving silently to where Sam was resting. "We've got company," he whispered, barely audible over the sound of the wind. Sam's eyes snapped open instantly. "Where?" they asked, their voice a low hiss. Ethan motioned toward the far corner of the factory, where the glow was coming from. "There's a light. Could be a campfire, maybe a group. We can't stay here." Sam cursed under their breath, pulling themselves up into a crouch. "How many?" "Couldn't see," Ethan replied, "but we need to move before they get any closer." Marcus stirred, his muttering turning into groans as he woke up. What's going on?" he asked, still groggy and disoriented. "Get up," Sam snapped quietly, throwing Marcus his pack. "We've got company. We're leaving." Marcus fumbled with his gear, his hands trembling as he struggled to pull himself together. The exhaustion from the past few days was evident in the dark circles under his eyes, but there was no time for sympathy. Ethan and Sam were already packing up, preparing to slip out before whoever was out there found them. Ethan led the way to the back of the factory, where the walls had partially collapsed. The opening wasn't large, but it would be enough for them to slip through without making too much noise. He motioned for Sam and Marcus to follow, his movements deliberate and cautious. Every step felt like a gamble. One wrong move, and they'd be discovered. As they squeezed through the gap, the cold night air hit them, biting against their skin. The streets were still eerily quiet, save for the distant crackle of the fire. Ethan glanced around, searching for the safest route. They couldn't afford to head directly north. The group with the fire was too close. They'd have to take a longer, more winding path to stay out of sight. "We head west first," Ethan whispered, "then loop back north once we're far enough away." Sam nodded, though their eyes never left the distant glow of the fire. "Let's go." They moved quickly and quietly, keeping low as they darted between crumbled buildings and debris. The city was a maze of destruction, every corner offering a new hazard or hiding place. Ethan's mind was racing with possibilities. Was it scavengers setting up camp? Or could it be another group of survivors, just as desperate as they were? Either way, it wasn't worth the risk to find out. They had been walking for about an hour when Marcus stumbled, his foot catching on a piece of rubble. He let out a sharp cry as he hit the ground, the sound echoing through the empty streets. "Shit!" Sam hissed, rushing over to pull Marcus up. "Are you trying to get us killed?" Marcus winced, grabbing his ankle. I didn't mean to. I think I twisted it." Ethan knelt beside him, his face tight with frustration. "Can you walk?" Marcus tested his weight on the injured foot, grimacing in pain. "I can, but not fast." Sam glared at Marcus, their patience wearing thin. "We don't have time for this. If those people are scavengers, they'll have heard you." "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to," Ethan cut him off. "It's fine, just try to keep up." But it wasn't fine. Ethan knew they were running out of options. Marcus was slowing them down, and the group they were running from might already be on their trail. They needed a new plan. "We'll find somewhere to hide," Ethan said, scanning the area. "Just for a little while, until we're sure they've passed." Sam's face was set in a hard line. "Hide where? This whole area's a death trap." Ethan didn't have an answer. The streets around them were barren, filled with nothing but rubble and wreckage. But then, just as he was about to speak, Marcus pointed to something up ahead. There, he said, his voice shaking. That building, it looks intact. Ethan followed Marcus's gaze. It was an old office building, its windows shattered, but its structure mostly intact. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Let's go, Ethan said. They moved toward the building, keeping low and out of sight. The entrance was blocked by debris, but there was a side door that looked usable. Ethan tested the handle, and it gave way with a soft creak. He pushed the door open, and the three of them slipped inside. The interior was dark, filled with dust and the smell of mildew. Broken furniture and scattered papers littered the floor, remnants of a world long gone. The building felt like a tomb, silent and forgotten. Ethan motioned for them to move deeper inside, away from the door. They found a small office on the second floor, its door still intact. It was cramped, but it provided some cover. Ethan blocked the door with a piece of furniture, then sat down, his back against the wall. "We'll wait here," he said, "just for a few hours." Sam didn't argue, though the tension between them was still palpable. They sat down across from Ethan, their eyes never leaving Marcus, who was trying to keep quiet, his ankle still throbbing with pain. The silence stretched on as the minutes ticked by. Outside, the wind howled, and the distant rumble of thunder hinted at an approaching storm. Ethan could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but he forced himself to stay alert. It wasn't long before the sound of footsteps reached their ears. They were faint at first, distant and barely noticeable, but they were getting closer. Ethan's pulse quickened as he strained to hear. Whoever was outside was moving through the rubble, their movements deliberate. Sam tensed, their hand tightening around the hilt of their knife. Marcus sat frozen, his eyes wide with fear. The footsteps stopped right outside the building. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the faint murmur of voices now, low, indistinct. They were close, too close. For several agonizing moments, the world outside was silent. Then the voices faded, the footsteps retreating into the distance. Ethan exhaled slowly, his muscles relaxing slightly, but the tension remained, hanging over them like a dark cloud. "We can't stay here much longer," Sam whispered, their voice barely audible. Ethan nodded. He knew Sam was right. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. But with Marcus injured and the group outside still hunting, they didn't have many choices left. "We move at dawn," Ethan said, his voice firm. "North. We stick to the plan." Sam didn't respond, but the look in their eyes told Ethan everything. They were losing faith. Faith in the plan, in Marcus, and maybe even in him. As the night dragged on, the storm outside finally broke, rain pounding against the shattered windows. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall, staring up at the cracked ceiling, wondering if they would survive long enough to reach the resistance, or if the dangers outside would consume them first. The thin line between survival and trust was growing thinner by the second. Chapter 8, The Echoes of the Past. Dawn broke over the city, casting a dull gray light through the broken windows of the office building. The storm had passed, but the remnants of the night lingered, a sense of dread mixed with the damp chill that hung in the air. Ethan stirred awake, the aches of sleeping on a hard floor settling into his bones. He glanced over at Sam, who was still dozing, their face contorted in an expression of worry. Marcus was awake, his legs stretched out in front of him as he gingerly tested his injured ankle. It was swollen, but the pain had dulled slightly, allowing him to move more easily. Ethan took a moment to gather his thoughts. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on him. They had narrowly escaped one danger, but the reality of their situation pressed down like the clouds overhead. They needed to move, and soon. "Marcus," Ethan said quietly, his voice low but firm. "How's the ankle?" Marcus looked up, his eyes weary but determined. "It's better. I think I can walk. Just a little slower than usual." Ethan nodded. "We'll manage. Just stick close to us." He turned to Sam, who was rubbing sleep from their eyes. "We're moving out in a few minutes," he said. "We need to head north and find a place to hide until we can assess the situation." Sam groaned, running a hand through their hair. "And if we run into more of those people? Then we'll deal with it," Ethan replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But we can't stay here any longer. They might come back." After a quick, silent breakfast of stale granola bars and sips of lukewarm water, they prepared to leave. Ethan checked the barricade they had set up at the door, ensuring it would be easy to remove. "Ready?" he asked, looking at both of them. They nodded, and he pushed the debris aside, stepping cautiously into the dim corridor beyond. The air was thick with dust, and each footfall felt like a countdown to discovery or safety. Ethan led them down the stairs and out the back door, into the cold light of morning. The streets lay quiet, but the remnants of last night's storm painted everything in a bleak sheen. Puddles collected in the dips of the road, reflecting the dilapidated buildings that loomed like ghosts. "Stay close," he murmured, scanning the surroundings, "and stay quiet." They moved quickly, staying low as they navigated through the maze of wreckage. As they crossed an open space, Ethan's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his veins. They were exposed, and every instinct screamed at him to hurry. "Over there," Sam whispered, pointing toward a partially collapsed building that looked somewhat intact. "It might be safer." Ethan nodded, leading them toward the structure. They ducked inside, grateful for the cover of the thick walls. The interior smelled of wet concrete and mildew, but it offered the safety they desperately needed. Once inside, they found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. Ethan tried a few of them, but they were either locked or too damaged to open. The whole building felt like it had been forgotten, left to decay alongside the world outside. "Let's take a breather," he said, lowering himself against a wall. "We need to gather our thoughts and figure out our next move." Sam dropped beside him, their expressions still tense. "Do you really think this resistance exists? That we'll find anyone who can help us?" Ethan hesitated. "I want to believe it does. We need to have something to hold on to, something to fight for." "But what if it's just another dead end?" Sam countered, frustration creeping into their voice. "We're wasting time. Or we're buying ourselves time to regroup." Marcus chimed in, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should look for more supplies while we're here, just in case." Ethan considered this. Supplies were always a priority, but they needed to stay focused on their goal. "We'll check this building for anything useful, but we can't linger too long. We're in enemy territory." With a nod of agreement, they split up, searching the hallways and rooms for anything they could use. Ethan found a small office filled with old furniture, including a desk cluttered with forgotten papers and a few cans of food, long past their expiration dates, but still potentially edible. He shoved them into his pack, feeling a glimmer of hope. As he rummaged through the desk, he stumbled upon a faded photograph tucked between the pages of a dusty notebook. The image showed a family, 2 parents and a young girl, all smiling, oblivious to the chaos that would soon unravel their world. He felt a pang of loss, a reminder of the lives that had been upended by the catastrophe. It was a fleeting moment of connection with a past that seemed so far away now. Ethan tucked the photo into his pocket, a small memento of the humanity that still existed, even amid despair. It gave him strength, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Meanwhile, Marcus had found a storage closet filled with cleaning supplies and other items that could be useful. He gathered a few bottles of bleach and some rags, putting them in his pack as he smiled at Ethan. These could come in handy. Sam, however, hadn't found much. They returned empty-handed, their disappointment evident. "I didn't find anything useful, just more broken stuff. This place is a wreck." Ethan frowned, aware that they needed more than just basic supplies. They needed hope. "Let's regroup and decide our next steps," he said, leading them back to the hallway. As they reconvened, a sudden noise broke the tense silence, a faint sound echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. It was muffled but unmistakable. Voices. Ethan's heart raced as he exchanged glances with Sam and Marcus. "Did you hear that?" he whispered urgently. Sam nodded, their eyes wide. "What do we do?" Ethan's mind raced. They could either hide or confront whoever was there, but they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. "We need to get out of here," he said, lowering his voice. Now. They turned to head back toward the entrance, but the sound of footsteps grew louder, the voices clearer. Someone was coming. "Quick, back this way!" Ethan hissed, gesturing toward a nearby room. They ducked inside, barely managing to close the door before anyone could see them. They huddled in the dark, hearts pounding in unison as they pressed against the wall, trying to remain as quiet as possible. The footsteps approached, and the voices were now distinct, angry and aggressive. "I told you to check the perimeter. We can't have these scabs wandering around here," a deep voice barked. "They'll ruin everything we've worked for." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Scabs? The word echoed in his mind, a term he'd heard used by scavengers to describe anyone who didn't belong to their group. They were in the territory of a hostile faction, and they had to get out. "Let's search the upper floors," another voice suggested. "They could be hiding anywhere." Ethan could feel the panic rising within him. They needed a way out, and quickly. He glanced at Sam and Marcus, who were both wide-eyed, fear palpable in the small space. "Do you see any windows?" Ethan whispered, desperate for a plan. Sam pointed to the far wall, where a window was partially intact, the glass still clinging to the frame. "There, we can climb out." "Good, let's go," Ethan said, inching toward the window. They could hear the footsteps growing closer, and he knew they didn't have much time. As they reached the window, Ethan pushed it open, the rusted hinges creaking in protest. The gap was small, but it was their best option. He climbed through first, careful not to make any noise, followed closely by Sam and then Marcus, who struggled but managed to get through without alerting anyone. They landed in a narrow alley, debris scattered around them, and quickly crouched down to catch their breath. The voices inside the building were now muffled but still audible, a reminder of how close they had come to being discovered. Ethan glanced up and down the alley, his instincts kicking in. "We need to move. Head north, but stay low." They darted out of the alley, sticking to the shadows, moving quickly but cautiously. The streets were deserted, but the danger felt palpable, lurking just beyond their line of sight. As they navigated through the ruins, Ethan's mind raced. They had escaped that close call, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. The need to find the resistance became more urgent with each passing moment. "Keep your eyes open," Ethan warned, his voice low but firm. "We have to be ready for anything." As they made their way toward the industrial district, they felt the weight of the city pressing down on them. The remnants of their past were all around, ghosts of what had once been a world now lost. But in that desolation, they also felt a flicker of hope. Together, they were stronger. Together, they would face whatever awaited them, even if the echoes of the past haunted them. Chapter 9, Into the Heart of Darkness. The city loomed around them like a broken giant, its skeletal structures reaching toward a bruised sky. As Ethan, Sam, and Marcus continued their trek north, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Every corner they turned felt like a gamble, and the earlier brush with danger had left them all on edge. They moved carefully, sticking to the shadows as they navigated the ruins. Each step was deliberate, echoing the need for survival in this desolate world. Ethan could feel the wariness in Marcus's gait, but he didn't dare suggest they take a break. They needed to keep moving. Every minute counted. "Do you think we lost them?" Sam asked quietly, glancing over their shoulder as if expecting a group of scavengers to appear at any moment. "I hope so," Ethan replied, though doubt lingered in his mind. "But we can't let our guard down. There's always a chance they're still searching for us." The trio continued forward, weaving through a labyrinth of concrete and steel. A sudden noise caught Ethan's attention, rustling behind a nearby wall. He held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. They froze, listening intently. "Just the wind," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper, though the fear in his eyes said otherwise. Ethan wasn't convinced. He took a cautious step forward, peering around the wall. His heart raced as he caught sight of movement. A small group of people, no more than 4, were scavenging through the remains of a dilapidated shop. They were ragged, dirty, and armed. "Scavengers," Ethan muttered, returning to his friends. "We need to find another route." Sam's brow furrowed. "But we can't just keep running. We have to find supplies soon. We can't survive on what little we have left." Ethan understood the gravity of the situation. They were running low on food, and Marcus's injury was becoming a growing concern. "We'll find supplies, but we have to be smart about it. If we can find a way around them, we can double back to that shop later." As they moved further away from the scavengers, Ethan felt the weight of uncertainty on his shoulders. He had been responsible for getting them this far, and the pressure was mounting. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. After a few minutes of navigating through the maze of ruins, they stumbled upon an old subway entrance, partially buried under debris. The rusted sign above it read, "Station closed." It looked as if it hadn't seen a train in years, but it offered a potential refuge. "Should we go down there?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. Ethan considered it. "It's worth checking. If we can find a safe spot, we might be able to rest and plan our next move." They descended cautiously, the air growing cooler as they stepped onto the cracked tiles of the subway platform. The darkness swallowed them, and the distant sound of dripping water echoed through the cavernous space. Faded advertisements clung to the walls, remnants of a world that had moved on without them. Once inside, they searched for a secure place to hide. Ethan found an alcove off to the side, partially obscured by a fallen piece of the ceiling. It would provide them cover from prying eyes, but it wouldn't shield them from any threats lurking nearby. "Let's settle here for a bit," he said, gesturing for them to move in. They huddled together, their backs against the cold, hard wall. Ethan rummaged through his pack, pulling out the scant food they had left. "We need to ration what we have. I don't know how long we'll be down here." "Can't we just find more?" Sam replied, frustration bubbling over. "We need to be proactive, not just sit here waiting." Ethan could see the fire in Sam's eyes, but he also recognized the exhaustion that accompanied it. "We will, but we can't risk getting caught by those scavengers. If we make noise or draw attention, we might be done for." The three of them fell into a heavy silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Ethan felt the tension between them, an unspoken understanding that survival was their only priority. After a while, Sam spoke up again, their voice softer this time. "What if we can't find the resistance? What if it's just a myth?" Ethan met Sam's gaze, trying to instill a sense of determination in his expression. "Then we create our own path. We'll keep pushing forward until we find something, anything. We can't lose hope." They shared a small meal, the meager rations doing little to satisfy their hunger, but it was enough to keep them going for now. As they sat in the dark, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of despair that lingered like a ghost, haunting them with every heartbeat. Hours passed, and the shadows around them deepened. The sound of water dripping grew louder, filling the silence as they sat in quiet contemplation. Just as Ethan began to doze off, a sudden noise jolted him awake. A clattering sound echoed through the subway, followed by hurried footsteps. "Someone's coming," Ethan whispered, his heart racing again. They all tensed, eyes wide, breaths shallow. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing off the tiles. Ethan gestured for them to be quiet, pressing himself against the wall. A small group appeared from the shadows, their figures illuminated by the faint light from a dying bulb hanging overhead. They were rough-looking, their clothes tattered and stained. But they weren't scavengers, they were survivors, just like Ethan, Sam, and Marcus. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options. Should he reveal themselves? Would they be allies or enemies? As the group drew nearer, one of them, a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a wary expression, caught sight of Ethan and the others. She stopped, raising a hand to signal her companions. "Hold up," she said, her voice low but firm. "Who are you?" Ethan stepped forward slowly, raising his hands in a non-threatening manner. "We're just trying to survive. We don't mean any harm." The woman narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing them. "You're not scavengers?" "No," Sam said, stepping up beside Ethan. "We escaped from a group a while back. We're looking for a safe place to stay, to find supplies." The woman seemed to relax slightly, her posture easing. "I'm Nora. These are my friends, Dylan and Layla." She nodded to the others, who remained cautious but curious. "We've been scavenging down here for a few days. Things are getting worse outside." Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could help each other. We need supplies, and you're familiar with this area. Nora exchanged glances with Dylan and Layla before turning back to Ethan. "We know where to find some food and gear, but it's risky. The scavengers patrol the streets. We'll need to stick together." "That's fine," Ethan said, feeling a sense of urgency. "We can't stay down here much longer. We need to move." "Then let's go," Nora replied, her voice steady, "but stay close and follow my lead." As they moved through the dimly lit subway, Ethan felt a spark of camaraderie forming. These people had been through the same struggles, faced the same fears. Maybe they weren't alone in this fight after all. Emerging from the subway, they stepped into the stark light of day, the city still draped in a blanket of despair. But this time, they weren't just three survivors wandering through the wreckage. They had allies now. Ethan felt a new resolve wash over him. Together, they would navigate this chaos, find what they needed, and move toward a future that still held glimmers of hope. But as they stepped into the unknown, he couldn't shake the feeling that danger still lurked around every corner, waiting to strike. Chapter 10: The Strength of Numbers. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the crumbling streets. Ethan, Sam, Marcus, and their newfound companions, Nora, Dylan, and Leela, moved with urgency but caution. The sense of unity among them was refreshing, yet the weight of uncertainty loomed heavily. They knew the dangers of the city, and the threat of scavengers was ever present. Nora led the way, her sharp instincts guiding them through back alleys and narrow streets. "We'll head to an old convenience store, I know," she explained. "It's mostly intact, and I think we can find some supplies there. But we need to be quick and quiet." As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising within him. They were no longer alone. With each step, he felt the burden of leadership shift slightly, shared among them all. But he also felt the weight of responsibility. If anything went wrong, he would never forgive himself. After a few minutes, they arrived at the convenience store, its windows shattered and door hanging limply on its hinges. The sign above the entrance was faded and broken, but it was clear that the building had seen better days. "Stay alert," Nora instructed, motioning for them to spread out and search for any threats. "I'll check inside first. Follow my lead." Ethan nodded, feeling the adrenaline course through his veins. He kept his eyes peeled as they approached the entrance, every sound amplified in the tense silence. The smell of decay wafted through the doorway, a reminder of how long this place had been abandoned. Inside the store was a mess. Aisles were overturned, shelves were bare, and debris lay scattered across the floor. But there were still remnants of the past. Cans of food, bottled water, and other supplies could be seen among the chaos. "Over here," Dylan called out from one of the aisles, excitement lacing his voice. "I found some cans." Ethan hurried over to join him, his heart racing as he knelt beside Dylan, inspecting the cans. They looked old but still sealed. "We should take whatever we can find," he said, stuffing a few into his pack. As they gathered supplies, the atmosphere shifted. A sudden noise echoed from the back of the store, a loud crash, followed by hurried footsteps. Ethan's heart sank. The scavengers were near. "Get down!" Nora shouted. Her voice sharp quickly motioned for everyone to hide behind the nearest aisle. They all crouched low, breathing quietly as the footsteps drew nearer. "Did you hear that?" A voice said from the back, rough and gravelly. It belonged to a man, probably a scavenger, and the sound of his boots echoed through the store. "Yeah, I heard it. Let's check it out." Another voice replied. Ethan felt panic rising within him. They were exposed, and if the scavengers found them, they wouldn't stand a chance. He exchanged glances with Sam and Marcus, their eyes filled with fear. "Stay quiet," Nora whispered, her eyes scanning the area. "They might just pass through." As the footsteps grew closer, Ethan held his breath, feeling every heartbeat thundering in his chest. He could see a shadow moving near the entrance, a figure outlined against the faint light. "Where'd they go?" the man grunted, frustration clear in his tone. "They can't have just vanished." "Maybe they were never here," the second voice suggested. "Let's check the back and see if they left anything." Ethan's mind raced. They had to act fast. "We can't wait for them to find us," he murmured to Nora. "We need to get out of here." Nora nodded, her expression resolute. "Agreed. We'll have to make a break for it. On my count, 3, 2, go." With that, they surged forward, darting through the aisles toward the back exit. Ethan's heart raced as they raced through the store, the adrenaline fueling their flight. Just as they reached the back door, a loud crash echoed through the aisles. One of the scavengers had spotted them. "Stop right there," the man shouted, his voice filled with rage. Ethan pushed through the door, tumbling into the alley behind the store. They had no time to think. They had to run. "Go, go, go," Nora urged, leading the way down the alley. They sprinted, their feet pounding against the pavement as they dodged debris and rubble. Behind them, the sound of shouts echoed, followed by the thunderous sound of footsteps closing in. "Head left!" Dylan shouted, pointing to a narrow opening between two buildings. They veered left, squeezing through the tight space just as they heard the scavengers barreling behind them. They emerged onto another street, the chaos of the city swirling around them. Ethan glanced back, his heart racing. "We need to split up," he called out. "They'll chase us down if we stick together." "No way," Nora replied. Determination etched on her face. "We're stronger as a group. We can't risk losing anyone." "Then we have to keep moving," Sam shouted, urgency driving their words. "They'll be right on us." With no time to argue, they took off again, darting down the street and into a cluster of abandoned vehicles. They ducked behind one of the larger cars, crouching low as they tried to catch their breath. "Do you think they saw us?" Marcus panted, his eyes wide with fear. "Not yet," Nora replied, peering cautiously around the vehicle. "But they won't give up easily. We need to stay quiet." Ethan felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They had been so close to finding supplies, and now they were back to square one, running for their lives. "Let's wait a moment," he said, his voice low. "If they pass us, we can regroup and figure out our next move." They all nodded, hearts pounding as they huddled behind the car. The sounds of the city surrounded them, but all they could focus on were the distant shouts of the scavengers searching for them. After a few tense minutes, the voices began to fade, the footsteps moving further away. Ethan exchanged glances with his companions, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over them. "Okay, let's go," Nora said finally, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here any longer." They slipped out from behind the car and continued down the street, sticking to the shadows. The city was still bustling with remnants of life, but it felt more dangerous than ever. The scavengers were out there, and they had made it clear they were hunting for survivors. As they navigated the streets, Ethan felt the presence of his companions beside him, a bond forming between them amid the chaos. They were no longer just individuals fighting for survival. They were a team, a group united by their shared experiences. After some time, they arrived at a small park overgrown with weeds and wild grass, the remnants of benches and a playground barely visible through the debris. It was a strange oasis in the middle of destruction. A place that once thrived with laughter and joy now lay silent. "Let's take a moment to regroup," Nora suggested, her voice calmer now. "We need to figure out our next steps and keep our spirits up." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude for this moment of reprieve. They settled onto the ground, catching their breath as the adrenaline began to fade. "Do you think they'll come after us again?" Sam asked, their eyes scanning the park. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But we can't take any chances. We need to keep moving, keep finding supplies." As they sat together, the weight of their situation began to settle in. They were weary, both physically and emotionally, but there was also a flicker of resilience in their hearts, a shared determination to survive against all odds. "Whatever happens, we stick together," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "We've already faced so much, and we're still here." Nora smiled, a flicker of warmth in her gaze. "That's right. We're stronger together." With renewed resolve, they rose to their feet, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan felt a sense of purpose growing within him as they stepped back into the unknown, determined to keep moving forward. Together, they would navigate the heart of darkness, seeking out the remnants of hope amid the ruins. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan believed they might just have a chance. Chapter 11. Echoes of the Past. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city transformed into a shadowy labyrinth. The once familiar streets morphed into treacherous pathways, each turn hiding unknown dangers. Ethan, Sam, Marcus, Nora, Dylan, and Layla moved cautiously, their senses heightened as they ventured deeper into the heart of the city. "We should find shelter for the night," Ethan suggested, glancing around at the crumbling buildings. "There's no sense in pushing ourselves too far after everything we've been through." Nora nodded, her eyes scanning the area. "There's an old school nearby. It might have some intact rooms we can use." "Let's do it," Sam agreed. "I'm not keen on spending another night out in the open." The group pressed on, weaving through debris-strewn streets and shattered glass. They finally arrived at the school, a large two-story building covered in vines and grime, its windows mostly shattered, but still standing. Once inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with memories. Echoes of laughter and learning lingered in the dust-covered hallways. Ethan could almost hear the voices of children playing, their carefree spirits a stark contrast to the grim reality they now faced. "Stay close," Nora cautioned, leading them through the darkened corridors. "We don't know what might be lurking in here." They explored the ground floor, checking classrooms for supplies. The desks were overturned, and remnants of papers scattered like leaves in the wind. As they moved through the rooms, Ethan felt a pang of nostalgia. He could almost picture the bustling energy of a school day, kids running around, teachers calling for attention. "Found anything?" Layla asked, breaking Ethan's reverie. "Just some old textbooks and a few scattered supplies," he replied, holding up a tattered notebook filled with faded drawings. "Nothing useful." As they continued their search, they stumbled into the gymnasium. The massive space was filled with broken bleachers and a dusty basketball court. In one corner, Ethan noticed a stack of crates pushed against the wall. "Maybe there's something in those crates," he suggested, motioning for the others to join him. They approached the crates cautiously, their hearts racing with anticipation. With a collective effort, they pried one open, revealing a cache of old sports equipment. Among the items was a small stash of canned goods, long expired but still sealed. "Food," Dylan exclaimed, his eyes lighting up. "We can use this." "Let's take what we can," Nora said, her practical nature shining through. "We'll need to find a way to open the cans, but this is a good start." As they gathered the supplies, Ethan noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A door at the far end of the gym stood ajar, shadows shifting inside. Curiosity tugged at him. "I'll check it out," he said, edging toward the door. The others watched, their expressions a mix of concern and intrigue. Ethan pushed the door open, revealing a storage room filled with dusty old equipment and forgotten memories. The faint smell of mildew permeated the air. As he stepped inside, his eyes fell upon a corkboard plastered with old photographs, pictures of students, teachers, and events long past. A sense of loss washed over him. These were people who had lived their lives, shared their dreams, and built a community, now reduced to memories. He touched one of the photographs, tracing a finger over the smiling faces, feeling the weight of what had been lost. "Ethan, you all right?" Sam's voice pulled him back to reality. "Yeah, just looking at these," he replied, turning to face his friends. "It's a reminder of what we're fighting for." Nora stepped into the room, her eyes glancing at the photographs. "It's easy to forget what life was like before all of this. We need to hold on to those memories, use them as motivation." With renewed determination, they gathered what they could from the storage room, including some blankets and a first aid kit that would prove invaluable. As they returned to the gym, they set up a makeshift camp, their spirits lifting slightly. As night fell, they shared a simple meal from their supplies, sitting together in a circle. The weight of the day began to ease as they exchanged stories, fragments of their lives before the world had crumbled. "I used to be a teacher," Nora shared, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I loved seeing my students grow, seeing them discover their passions. I miss that." Ethan felt a pang of empathy. We all have things we miss, but we have each other now, and we can help rebuild something from the ashes. Marcus nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "We've come this far, and we're not giving up. We'll find the resistance and make a difference." As they settled into the night, Ethan felt a sense of camaraderie enveloping them. They were no longer just individuals fighting for survival. They were a family, bonded by their struggles and hopes. But as he drifted off to sleep, a nagging worry lingered in the back of his mind. What lay ahead? Would they find the resistance? And if so, what challenges awaited them? Chapter 12. A New Dawn. The first light of dawn broke through the cracked windows of the gymnasium, casting golden rays across the dust-covered floor. Ethan stirred awake, the warmth of the sun washing over him like a comforting blanket. He glanced around, seeing his friends still sleeping peacefully, their faces relaxed in the quiet of the morning. For a moment, he allowed himself to savor the stillness, a stark contrast to the chaos that had become their everyday lives. But the reality of their situation soon crept back in, reminding him of the journey that lay ahead. Rise and shine, everyone, Ethan called softly, nudging Marcus awake. We have a lot to do today. As they gathered their belongings and prepared for the day, Ethan felt a growing sense of purpose. Today was the day they would push forward, seeking out the rumored resistance that could be their salvation. After a quick breakfast, they discussed their next steps. We need to head to the northern outskirts, Nora suggested. I've heard whispers of a safe haven there, where survivors are gathering. Then that's where we're going, Ethan agreed, feeling a sense of determination in his gut. We can't waste any time. With their packs secured and their spirits renewed, they set out from the school, stepping back into the world that had been stripped of its former glory. The city was waking up around them, the sounds of distant commotion echoing through the streets. As they moved cautiously, navigating through the ruins, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He was leading his friends into the unknown, but he also knew they were stronger together. After a few hours of walking, they reached the outskirts of the city. The atmosphere shifted, the remnants of civilization giving way to overgrown vegetation and crumbling structures. In the distance, they could see a gathering of people, a small community forming amidst the decay. There it is, Dylan pointed, excitement evident in his voice. That must be the resistance. Ethan's heart raced. They had made it. They were on the cusp of discovering a new beginning. As they approached, they could see the outlines of makeshift tents and shelters, people milling about, their faces etched with determination. Let's stay cautious, Nora said, her tone serious. We don't know how they'll react to newcomers. As they entered the encampment, they were met with curious glances. The air buzzed with a mix of tension and hope. Ethan could see people working together, sharing resources, and discussing plans. A tall man approached them, his expression wary but not hostile. Who are you? He asked, sizing them up. We're survivors, Ethan replied, stepping forward. We've traveled a long way to find the resistance. We heard you're helping people. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. We're trying to build something here, but trust is hard to come by in these times. What do you have to offer? Ethan felt the pressure mounting. We can help, he insisted. We have skills, we're resourceful, and we're willing to work. We just want a chance. The man studied them for a moment before nodding. All right, you can stay for now, but we'll need to see what you're capable of. As they were shown to a communal area, Ethan felt a mix of relief and apprehension. They had found a glimmer of hope, but the path ahead was still uncertain. They would need to prove themselves to earn their place among this community. Days turned into weeks as Ethan, Sam, Marcus, Nora, Dylan, and Layla integrated into the resistance. They worked tirelessly, helping to fortify the camp, gather supplies, and support those in need. Ethan found himself taking on more leadership roles, guiding others and sharing his experiences. With each passing day, the sense of community deepened. They shared meals, exchanged stories, and celebrated small victories. Laughter began to fill the air, a sound that had been absent for so long. One evening, as the sun set behind the makeshift tents, Ethan stood on a small rise overlooking the camp. He watched as his friends interacted with others, their faces glowing with hope and resilience. He felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of belonging that had been missing. Hey, Nora said, joining him. You've done a lot for this place. People look up to you. Ethan smiled, humbled by her words. I couldn't have done it without everyone else. We're all in this together. Yeah, but it's your leadership that's making a difference, she replied, her gaze thoughtful. You're inspiring others to believe again. As they stood together, the weight of the past began to lift. They had fought hard to survive, and now they were building a new future, one rooted in hope and unity. In that moment, Ethan realized that while the world had changed, so had he. They had all changed. The darkness that had once threatened to consume them had transformed into a beacon of light, a testament to their strength and resilience. As the stars began to twinkle above, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had come so far, and though challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. Together, they would forge a new path in this post-apocalyptic world, a path filled with hope healing, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Epilogue: the dawn of a new era. Months later, the resistance had grown into a thriving community. The camp had expanded, with new families joining and new structures rising. The spirit of collaboration and hope infused every corner, and the echoes of laughter returned to the air. Ethan stood in the center of the camp, surrounded by friends old and new. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. The future was still uncertain, but their resilience was unwavering. As he looked around at the faces of those he had come to care for deeply, he felt a sense of pride. They had all fought for this, fought for the chance to rebuild, to create a world worth living in. The sun rose on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the camp. It was a new day, a new beginning, and Ethan knew they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. In the heart of the darkness, they had found their light. And as long as they stood united, that light would continue to shine, illuminating their path toward a brighter future. End of story. This conclusion brings the journey full circle, highlighting the transformation of the characters and their newfound hope in a community. If you need any adjustments or want to expand further on any aspects, just let me know.